Joan Lunden has been a trusted voice in American homes for more than 30 years. For nearly 2 decades, Joan greeted viewers each morning on Good Morning America, bringing insight into the day's top stories. As the longest-running female host ever on early morning television, she reported from 26 countries, covered 5 presidents, 5 Olympics, and kept Americans up to date on how to care for their homes, their health, and their families. Joan continues to be one of America's most recognized and trusted personalities. She's an award-winning journalist, a best-selling author, an international speaker, and a special correspondent on the NBC's Today Show. Like many baby boomers here in America, Joan has had to balance being a working mom of 7 with being a caregiver to an aging parent. After experiencing the challenges of caring for her own mother, Joan went on to become one of the nation's leading advocates, speaking out about family, caregiving, and healthy aging. As an advocate for families everywhere, Joan's mission is to help Americans through their caregiving journey by sharing what she's learned along the way. So please join me now in giving a warm Maine welcome to Joan Lunden.
Hi, it's great to be here in Portland. This is really like coming home for me. For those of you who don't know, I call Naples, Maine home every summer, have for the last 20 years. I'm also delighted to be here today because caregiving is a subject that is very close to my heart, having cared for decades, really, for my mom as she aged, and also for my brother, who suffered from some of the more debilitating complications of type 2 diabetes. And today I want to really talk about what this conference, I think, is all about, is how we can be better prepared for this chapter of our life when all of a sudden our loved ones need us, whether it's due to aging or a health crisis or a family tragedy. Having a plan in place can make all the difference in the world. Unfortunately, we never really sat down and had that conversation. Oh, I see all of you going, oh yeah, that one. You know, it's the conversation that every family needs to have, but we just don't tend to do it. You're going to hear it probably again and again today. Dealing with all those issues before a crisis hits, while our loved ones are still able to provide us with answers, that can really make an emotional and difficult life event so much easier to manage. You know, according to a recent survey, 66% of the U.S. population, and that's more than 138 million people, believe that they will need to provide care for someone in their future. But at the same time, the majority of Americans say they have not taken adequate steps to prepare for that possibility or the possibility that they will need to be cared for in the future. And when asked what steps they have taken, only 4 in 10 adults say that they have set aside funds to cover expenses or signed a living will or a healthcare power of attorney. If they don't have a will, when that day comes, you won't know how they wish to be buried or how they wish to distribute their belongings. And if you don't have an advance healthcare directive, you won't know their wishes when faced with tough decisions when their life is in the balance. And as I've become an advocate in this space for boomers and senior care, I've had the opportunity to connect with others all across this country who are providing care to loved ones. Within the next few years, for the first time in human history, the number of adults over 65 will far outnumber the children under 15. And it's almost hard to believe, but the most rapid growth in the U.S. population today, here in our country, is those over 100. Right now, there's 66,000 people in this country, over 100. By 2020, which is not that far away, the Census Bureau estimates that it will be up to 214,000. You think that sounds like a lot? Wait. By 2050, that number will be close to 1 million. That is how the demographic of this country is changing and how the caregiving industry is going to have to change. In this new world of ours, where we are all going to be living longer and longer, it is more important than ever before that families begin this planning process and that we have that important conversation about our parents' wishes for these new extended later years and, frankly, our own thoughts about our later years. They say going forward that people will likely spend more time taking care of their parents than they did their children. Caring for those in your community and providing services not only for the cared for, but the caregiver, that is what truly makes the difference. And I want to thank Hospice of Southern Maine for inviting me here today to be with you. I think it's wonderful that you're all going to learn how to fill out an Advance Healthcare Directive. It's a short form with some of the toughest questions, but it's so important that you answer them. Thanks, everyone.
"82%, and I suspect more here, of all people say that an Advanced Care Directive is a very, very important aspect to their wishes when it comes to the end of their lives. Universally accepted. However, only 23% of people have actually done it. So what we're going to try to do today is educate and help and encourage you in that process.
Well, certainly working in end of life, we always see situations where when someone has completed an advance directive and have had meaningful conversations with their families, we see what a difference it makes in their end of life experience, both for the patient and for their family as well. And as someone working in bereavement as a grief counselor, I often see the end result of a situation where the family did not have advance directives, and the layers that adds to my client's grief experience when nobody knew, they hadn't talked about anything, they didn't know what anyone wanted, there was fighting in the family at a time that is already so highly charged and painful as you witness someone you love dying. So those of us who work in end of life all the time, we recognize and wish that everyone could have these very meaningful conversations with the people in their life. Most of us will die after experiencing a chronic, life-threatening illness. About 80% of us will die from our final illness. And that means that about 80% of us will die under the care of healthcare providers. And when the time comes to make these important decisions at end of life, about 50% of us will be unable to speak for ourselves or communicate what my wishes are. So we also know that the healthcare field, they will err on the side of treatment if they don't know what my wishes are. And no one in my family knows what my wishes are. So we know that health professionals and our families, unless we've had these meaningful conversations, we can't make an assumption that they know what we want.
I just want to follow up on something Carol said about how important these documents are. And they're so important that Maine law allows you to sign this document without being in the presence of a notary, and you do not need a lawyer to complete the Advance Healthcare Directive. So the idea is to make this document available to everyone. We do require, or I should say Maine law requires, that you sign in the presence of two witnesses. But that does not mean you have to explain all of the choices you've made. They merely need to see you sign the document, and then they sign themselves. So copies of the Advance Healthcare Directive are as effective as an original. And so once you sign this document, you want to give it to not only the people that you have designated as your agent and the backups, which I will get into in a minute, but you also want to provide one to your physician. You may want to give them to family members so that they're not surprised if sibling number 8 is chosen first, so that everyone knows what your wishes are. And many people that I work with put a copy of their Advance Healthcare Directive in their glove compartment. So who is an agent? Well, an agent is a person that you designate in your Advance Healthcare Directive to make healthcare decisions when you are no longer able to make them yourself. You want someone who is very comfortable and confident making decisions. It's great if you can choose someone who's comfortable with medical details and can easily handle the options. And I find working with these families, with parents, and with the children, it's important to have someone who's comfortable communicating with others. I think it's really difficult for a person to be incompetent. An agent is acting for them, but no one else is getting any information. So while you want a very strong person, you want someone who's also willing to work with others. If you don't choose an agent, Maine law has a list of people who have priority to serve as your surrogate. So this alone should be enough to get you to complete this document. You may well want the people who are in line, but I work with many people who say, I know that my spouse would not be able to allow me to be taken off the life support. So I am not going to name my spouse as my agent. I'm going to name someone else who I know will carry out my wishes. The agent's authority becomes effective when you are incapacitated, when you lack competency and capacity to understand what your current medical situation is and to understand what your options are.
You know, so many times when I talk with people about planning for their future and for aging, they say, I have a will. That's great that you have a will, but what about the 5, 10, 15 years before you die? Those are really the complicated years. But if you don't fill out an advanced healthcare directive, then your adult children are going to have to make every health decision for you. For people who don't know what that is, and they might also hear it referred to as a living will, it's a piece of paper that speaks for you when you can't speak for yourself any longer.
So this is where I think some of the meat of this document being really a guideline for the agents that you've chosen begins. And there's kind of 3 sections. And I like to point out that the first part, which has these 2 checkboxes, choice to prolong life and choice not to prolong life, that saying choice not to prolong life is not the same as choosing do not resuscitate or DNR, and I have a lot of patients who confuse the 2. What this question is really asking is, if you have a serious condition such that your doctors don't think that you're going to recover or that you're likely to die quite soon, do you still want medical procedures to try to prolong your life as long as humanly possible? Or do you want to take the approach of, not involving life prolonging measures and allowing kind of natural processes to take over? And when we talk about these life prolonging measures, some of the things that are most common are the question of, if you're not able to adequately breathe for yourself, do you want to be put on a breathing machine, a ventilator? When they are on a breathing machine, that involves being in the intensive care unit, and that it involves being sedated such that you're in a medically induced coma. So this is not, going home with a breathing machine in your neck and otherwise living your life. This is a very invasive procedure, an invasive sort of way of living, and it's not really conducive to otherwise living your life the way you have been. And this has been my experience dealing with families. it is much easier to withhold these treatments from the beginning, so not even put the breathing tube in, than it is to withdraw them down the road, or so-called, quote-unquote, pull the plug. And I have a lot of patients who tell me, oh, my family knows to just pull the plug. And it's a lot easier said than done. I think there's probably nothing else in this world that's easier said than done. And I've had a lot of these conversations with families who are put in that position, and it is agonizing. And it often leads to very prolonged dying processes with a lot of suffering, because patients are suffering with these tubes in, and families are suffering with making a decision, recognizing that taking the tube out means certain death, but that there is really no hope of avoiding death even with the tube. And so it really puts everybody in a really tough position. And it involves dying in an ICU, where we know that most people in this country want to die at home with their family members around them, and dying in an ICU is not what most people would choose. So when you're choosing that, choice not to prolong life, it's not choosing an early death or to be have death hastened. It is merely choosing to sort of allow the natural processes of your illness to take over, and to kind of focus on your comfort when there really is nothing else that the medical system can do to prolong your life toward a good outcome.
So I think probably where I want to start with addressing the idea of symptom management at end of life is this very common misconception about hospice. I'm going to speak very much on that spectrum of things. There's probably many people in here whose thoughts about hospice can be neatly summed up in this. They bring you to hospice, they start pumping you full of the morphine, that's a capital T and a capital M, and then you die while we stayed out there kind of looking at our clock saying, let's get a move on, we got somebody else to move through. And I know that sounds kind of funny, ha-ha, but I think in a lot of ways that is the conception that many people have about what hospice means. The idea that coming to hospice is giving up, that it's no longer, I'm not trying to live anymore. Really nothing could be further from the truth. Now, do we utilize a lot of narcotics to alleviate symptoms at end of life? Yes, we do. Can they be sedating? They absolutely can. But every time we are recommending and using these tools, the idea is relief of suffering. There's absolutely no intent that this would hasten somebody's passing. But if you are talking to anybody who's being honest about this, there is a distinct possibility that using these treatments will indeed hasten your passing. And many times when family members or the patients themselves are expressing concern about the fact that these medications are going to sedate them and not allow them to be present during the end stages of their life, I do have to be honest and say that may be the case. But there is going to be a point where you need to have relief from the physical, the things that have got their hooks dug into you and they're holding you here. By the time people are with me, it's no longer a question about if you're going to die. It's really a question about how you're going to die. And palliation of pain is one of the most important things we can do in order to help you die well. So we're talking about getting over the whole part about if, but how. And people don't like to talk about that. It's getting over the if is really, really hard. But when you do get over the if, and we can have a real conversation about the how, that's where excellent symptom management really comes into place. And now what does that have to do with advanced care directives? Well, guess what? Chances are the people that you are appointing to help you make these decisions don't actually know your feelings about this. And I think Dr. Kowalef pointed it out very well. I think everybody said it really well. People kind of assume, oh, my husband knows me well, or my kids know exactly what I want. And then I will tell you what will happen is kid A will be in there saying, you better not give mom anything that sedates her. She's writhing around in pain. She's clearly short of breath. Don't you dare sedate her. She wouldn't want to be knocked out. You've got son B who said, oh, mom said she clearly wanted to be made comfortable no matter what. Pain is an easy thing to talk about because we've all been in pain at one point in time. We all know how it affects us physically and psychologically. Even if it was transient, we know how miserable we were. And if we think about people who have processes at the end of life that are causing pain that's not going to go away, you can imagine just how much that would affect your quality of life. So treatment of pain, both in palliative care and hospice care, is really paramount to promoting quality of life.
These are not easy questions to answer. I don't pretend that they are, but they're questions that we all need to think about when we're still able to think about them and talk with our family members and friends and doctors and come up with our conclusion. And you know, the more people that we can get to plan ahead and have all the important papers at hand, that's going to make the aging process and the caregiving process so much easier for the aged and for all the adult children that have to step in and assume the role of caregiver.
So DNR means do not resuscitate, and DNI means do not intubate. It just simply means that no effort is going to be made to restart your heartbeat or your breathing in an emergency situation, right? So if EMS comes to your home and you have a do not resuscitate order signed by you and the physician, if it's not signed by you and the physician, they will go right to work. If it is, they will not do any chest compressions, they will not give you any medications, they will not use the defibrillator, and they will not insert a breathing tube. In the hospital where I work, in nursing homes and in the home health setting, there also needs to be a specific DNR order entered into your medical record. So even if you have this at home, if you don't travel into the hospital with it, and you hit the emergency room, and you go into a cardiac arrest, they will initiate CPR. This is a really big deal. So when you come into the purview of emergency medical services, that's what they're trained to do. So you really need to make sure that this is part of your medical record. Even before you are hospitalized, you can have that done. So when is it medically appropriate? Most physicians want to look at a DNR order in a fairly specific kind of framework. So usually the patient has a potentially life-limiting illness, and the patient, certainly any patient, and this is sort of a medical ethics issue, any patient with capacity has the right to refuse any treatment. So in theory, any one of you really can become a DNR, but most people are not looking to do that, right? So usually it's in collaboration with a physician. The physician is usually on board with it, and then you have this order signed. So what it is not, and Rebecca touched on this a little bit, that DNR, do not resuscitate, does not mean comfort measures only. And we do have families who are really scared when a physician brings up in the hospital the concept of DNR for their loved one. So say you have a frail elderly person who is, has congestive heart failures in the latter stages of that, and it just wouldn't make sense to do CPR on them. It would actually cause more harm. This is the kind of thing where, a DNR does not mean the same thing as comfort measures only. So we're treating this person still with antibiotics if she's ill, and with any other medically indicated procedures that will still keep the patient going. So it's very different from comfort measures only.
Part 4 of the Advance Directive talks about the donation of body organs and tissues at the time of death. And this is very important. If you want your organs to be donated, it's always important to have this written down on the Advance Directive. That way your relatives know exactly what your wishes are, whether you do want organ donation or whether or not you don't want organ donation. The most important thing I want to talk about today is in regards to the individual who will have custody and control over your body at the time of death. In the state of Maine, as many of you folks know, that at the moment of death, all power of attorney rights immediately end at that point in time. Then down the road, you have an executor or personal representative of your estate, but that doesn't have anything to do with your physical body. A lot of times people think it's part of it, but it doesn't. The will, executor of the state, representative, that has to do with your physical stuff and personal belongings and finances. In between the end of power of attorney and when a personal representative is appointed or is put into place to handle your final distribution of assets, we have this window of the Maine next of kin laws. Many of you are familiar with how those work. I'm not going to go right down through the list here because it can get a little confusing to go through it all, but in a married couple, the spouse automatically becomes the next of kin. If there isn't a spouse, the children become the next of kin. But oftentimes you meet with people who truly have no idea of what their loved one wanted. So it's so important to just talk about what you would want for funeral arrangements. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to run out and make an appointment with your local funeral home or whoever you choose to use. That does not necessarily mean that. That's very helpful for your family and to put your ideas in writing and in a file at the funeral home. But it's most important to just have that conversation with your family. I want to be cremated. I want to be buried. I want to be buried over at that little cemetery by the church, over by the corner. I want to be my ashes scattered here or there. Having those things jotted down, or at least just having your family knowing those decisions, just makes it so much easier on your family at the time and doesn't put them in a position where they're simply guessing, is this what my loved one wanted? Or I'm not sure, maybe. Who knows? It puts things in a lot much more of a concrete perspective so that your family members will have a better peace of mind when that inevitable time comes.
We all know that life endings are going to be part of our reality. And then you come to one of those life endings, and there's no preparing you for it. They are very emotional. It affects everyone differently, but I think that when you have the calm and the peace and the understanding that the really tough questions, how far do we let this go? Do we put them on a respirator or don't we? How would they want this ending to be? If we know that that's in place, it just makes all the difference in the world. And it's not possible for me to say then you can just enjoy it. There's nothing enjoyable about it. But you can live with it and live through it and feel that you can be there to be that hand-holding emotional support until the last breath, because you aren't having to be in complete emotional turmoil over trying to figure out all those tough questions at that last moment that you wished you had spoken to your loved one about when they were still able to give you answers.